Welcome, fellow travelers of the forgotten roads and wanderers of wilds to the Verdant Enclave. I'm your host and sometimes friendly DM. More relevant to today's discussion, I'm also your fellow wanderer and wilderness guide to the Ranger class of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. There are two primary questions I am examining in this adventure, but I chose to add an extension to one of them, as it is a statement I've heard before in relation to Rangers. The original two questions are, does the Ranger need Hunter's Mark in order to do comparable damage? And are fighters better as archers than Rangers? The extended question is, do Rangers need their spells in order to keep up with martial class damage output? To clarify, comparable should be understood as equivalent. In other words, in order for the statement to be true, Rangers would have to use Hunter's Mark in order to do the same damage as a fighter or a paladin or a rogue or any of the other martial classes. If they don't need Hunter's Mark, then the statement is not true. It recently occurred to me that I should clarify or contextualize some of what I am doing in the game, especially bending some of the rules. For example, Glancing Blow. My players and myself didn't like missing by only 1 point on the attack roll. Originally I was letting players choose an outcome, either favorable or unfavorable, but that was proving uninteresting, so instead I implemented this idea of letting the attack hit, but only for half damage, as though the target had been granted temporary resistance. However, I continued to record the battle damage rolled at its face value. The rogue is a lower level than the fighter and the ranger, and the result is that the rogue's numbers are going to be skewed, as the rogue would not face the same challenges in the same conditions, and at level 3 would face only one enormous fight, which was luckily structured to be exceptionally good for Wood Elf Rogue. This is not an excuse for the rogue's high damage, but rather context for how it occurred, and it remains to be seen if that will be a constant. Further, spell damage will be tracked for the purpose of determining each level's overall damage total, but unless it is a damage writer spell, it will not be a factor in calculating average damage per hit, as the spell damage isn't necessarily dependent on whether or not a weapon attack hits. While most optimizers build their characters and determine the quality by estimating, through one means or another, average damage per round, from my perspective and the way I'm tracking the data, I am not evaluating the data on a per round basis, but on a per hit basis, as it's simply easier for me to keep track that way. Let's get started with the rogue. Thea has progressed from level 4 through level 6 now. At level 4, Thea made 27 attacks and 15 hits, for a hit to attack ratio of 55.56%. Sneak attack added 74 points, which was 33.04% of the level's overall damage. Cunning action was used to hide successfully 9 out of 11 attempts, disengage once, and dash 0 times. Thea took Sharpshooter at level 4 rather than an ability score improvement, and used it 6 times, 3 successfully, for 30 extra points of damage, or 13.39% of level overall damage. At level 5, Thea made 29 attacks and 18 hits, for a hit to attack ratio of 62.07%. Sneak attack added 93 points, or 26.72% of total level damage. Cunning action was used to hide successfully 19 out of 23 attempts, 0 times to disengage, 4 times to dash, and Fast Hands was used 3 times successfully. Sharpshooter was used 20 times, 11 successfully,
for 110 points, 31.61% of total level damage. Uncanny Dodge was used 3 times, reducing damage taken by 13 points. At level 6, Thea made 24 attacks and 15 hits, for a hit-to-attack ratio of 62.5%. Sneak Attack added 69 points, or 30.53% of total level damage. Cunning Action was used to hide successfully 8 of 11 times, disengage 3 times, dash twice, and fast hands 2 out of 2 times. Sharpshooter was used 6 times, 3 successfully, for 30 extra points, or 13.27% of total level damage. Uncanny Dodge was used once, reducing damage taken by 4 points. Longstrider was cast at 2nd level from her Ring of Spell Storing, and Thea used 2 charges of her Charm of Restoration. At level 4, Thea dealt 150 points of straight weapon damage and totaled 224 with Sneak Attack. Thea made 255 points of weapon damage at level 5 and totaled 348 with Sneak Attack. Finally, Thea rolled 157 points of weapon damage, totaling 226 with Sneak Attack. Thea's average per hit was 14.93, 19.33, and 15.07 at levels 4, 5, and 6 respectively. Adrian completed level 7, during which he made 55 attacks for 46 hits, for a hit-to-attack ratio of 83.64%. His weapon attacks totaled 377 points of damage. Firebolt was used 21 times for 202 points of damage, or 35% of his total level damage. Expeditious Retreat was cast 2 times, enabling the fighter to dash 9 times with his bonus action. Darkness was used twice, and Shield was used 6 times. Magic Missile was used 5 times, for a total of 72 points, 11% of total level damage. The Staff of Paralysis paralyzed a flying creature, adding 22 points of bludgeoning damage, or 3.27% of overall level damage. Action Surge was used 4 times, twice to Firebolt, once to cast Darkness, and once to attack, adding 20 points of damage, or 3% of total level damage. Second Wind was used 4 times, recovering 48 hit points. Over the course of level 7, Adrian accumulated 673 points of damage, 56.02% of which was due to weapon attacks, and 43.98% due to magic, none of which were damage rider types of spells. With the damage divided by hits, including Action Surge, Adrian's average per hit was 8.2, or 0.25 points below the baseline. Without Action Surge, then the average damage per hit drops to 7.76, which is 0.69 points below the baseline.
Varen made 70 hits out of 92 attacks, for a hit-to-attack ratio of 76.09%. Longstrider was used 3 times, the second at 2nd level, and one of those was to cast the same spell into Thea's ring. Jump was cast once, Locate Animals or Plants was used once, and Spike Growth was used twice, for 123 points of damage, only 13% of total level damage. Natural Explorer and Favorite Enemy were both used 7 times, and Colossus Slayer was used 41 times, for 220 points, or 23% of level total damage. Primeval Awareness was used 2 times, and Steel Will was used 3 times. The last use would have been a failed save, if it were not for Steel Will. Varen's total level 7 damage was 952 points, 87.08% of which was due to weapon damage, and 12.92% due to spell damage. Including Colossus Slayer, Varen's average damage per hit was 11.84, 3.39 above the baseline, 4.08 above the fighter without Action Surge, or 3.65 above the fighter with Action Surge. Varen used no Damage Rider type spells. Here are the three classes as they have progressed so far. For the purposes of this comparison, I've removed the effect Colossus Slayer, Action Surge, and Sneak Attack have on the averages, as well as any magical consideration. Almost right away we notice that the rogue's average per hit, indicated by the yellow line, continues to rise past where it jumped to at level 3, as high as 14.17 at level 5, only to be followed by a significant drop at level 6. Some context might help explain this. The rogue took Sharpshooter at level 4, which can add damage to each hit, but also the rogue has fewer hits because the rogue does not get an extra attack feature. And this means that damage can be boosted even though the denominator remains small, therefore raising the average. What this line indicates is that the rogue, without Sneak Attack, is an efficient damage dealer, able to pack a lot of power into a single hit. The gray line represents the fighter's average per hit, which is shockingly lower than the baseline at many points. Again, context matters here. The fighter can generate more attacks per turn than the rogue can, which means what damage they can deal is divided across more hits, reducing the efficiency of the fighter's per hit. Also, the fighter chose a feat at level 4 like the rogue did, which means that the fighter's attack ability did not increase, reducing both damage overall and their chance to hit their target. Finally, though being designed to be an archer to compare more directly against the ranger, the player has chosen to rely primarily on sword and shield, which means that the fighter rarely uses their archery fighting style, further reducing their chance to hit. Speaking of the ranger, represented here by the orange line, we see that the ranger maintains a respectable margin above the baseline, as well as a rather more consistent result. With less choices to make than the fighter, and more attacks to make than the rogue, this results in the ranger being more focused on damage dealing than the fighter, and a higher chance to hit than the rogue, especially because instead of choosing a feat, the ranger chose to focus on increasing their primary battle attribute. But what happens when we add in the class features? The first thing we notice is that the rogue's sneak attack enhances even more the turn-by-turn efficiency of the rogue's attack. There is a tremendous difference between the rogue's averages and the other two, but rather than showing consistency, there is a great deal of shifting along the rogue's yellow line, shooting up and down with dramatic effect. Partly this might be explained by the rogue relying heavily on the sharpshooter feat at first, as we see a dip in level 4's average, but then the rogue's average jumps at level 5, and plummets back down at level 6. Somewhere between level 5 and 6, the rogue's ability to generate or gain advantage, a preferred condition not only for hitting but for also getting sneak attack damage, started running into complications. Monster movements, tactical priorities, and environmental factors inhibited the rogue's ability to hide, or negated the rogue's advantage. The fighter's gray line overall certainly improved with the addition of Action Surge, but it seems to be struggling to break away from the blue baseline, possibly explained by the Eldritch Knight having a variety of spell options, and other options to choose between for their action and bonus action expenditures.
It should not be ignored that the fighter has been consistently relying on his short sword since level 4, which also deals a lower base damage die than the longbow. By the fighter's admission, it felt as though he was doing more with a sword and shield than with a longbow. And, tactically speaking, the player is not wrong. There have been several battles and moments in battle where the fighter's ability to draw attention to himself and avoid damage has directly and positively affected the battle's outcome, though it apparently hindered the fighter's averages. The orange line of the Ranger, while certainly not as dramatic as the Rogue, rose higher again than the baseline, and is showing consistent returns and a steady rise over the course of several levels. Recall, if you will, that the Ranger took no feat, as the Fighter and the Rogue did, choosing to increase dexterity alongside proficiency, and has Colossus Slayer almost constantly, with or without advantage or conveniently placed allies, while the Rogue has sometimes struggled to earn advantage in order to gain sneak attack. Further, the Ranger has a lot less to distract from the primary objective, which in combat is to attack the enemy. So while certainly less versatile on a given turn than the Fighter or the Rogue, it does seem to indicate that the Ranger's consequential, intense focus on attacking lends itself rather nicely to boosting average per hit. You may recall that I added a question for consideration regarding the Ranger in comparison to the others. Specifically, do Rangers need their spells in order to be comparable to the other martial classes? Let's take a look at how that's going. Here are the character's total damage outputs by level as covered so far, not including class features Action Surge, Colossus Slayer, or Sneak Attack, or special abilities such as Magic added in. So this is strictly weapons only damage. Following the gray bar for the Rogue, we see that, except at level 3, which as has been discussed might be more an aberrant level for the Rogue rather than a consistent trend, the Rogue struggled to keep up with the Fighter and the Ranger until 4th level, when the Rogue chose to take the Sharpshooter feat. If you noticed during the discussion on the Rogue's results, the Sharpshooter feat for the Rogue hits roughly about half the times it's used. But seeing as how it enabled the Rogue to beat the Fighter's level 4 damage, this might not be a bad trade-off. However, since then, at levels 5 and 6, the Rogue has not even been able to achieve 50% of what the Fighter could slam out, and the Fighter also chose a feat at level 4, which similarly did not improve the Fighter's chance to hit. But at the same time, neither did it detract from the Fighter's chances as Sharpshooter did for the Rogue. Now the Fighter, shown by the orange columns, really stepped into their own at level 5, skyrocketing above their previous levels with shocking ease. But without using Action Surge or Colossus Slayer, and without relying on Ranger magic, the Ranger has kept above the Fighter at every level. This is true even at the levels where the Fighter and Ranger were using the same weapons, had the same ability scores, and were facing the exact same enemies in the exact same circumstances. With that in mind, let's see what happens when Action Surge, Colossus Slayer, Sneak Attack, and Magic are all added in. Now, with all features and magic added in, we get a much clearer picture. While the Rogue is the more efficient at packing damage into a single hit so far, it has trouble with producing reliably growing levels of damage with its advancing levels. Even with Sneak Attack's ever-increasing pool of damage die, the Rogue's overall damage per level has been, so far, less than consistent and less than overwhelming. With Action Surge and the Eldritch Knight's access to magic, the Fighter competes fairly evenly with the Rogue, up until level 5, at which point the Fighter gets extra attack and goes to town with it. This does not, however, enable the Fighter to surpass the Ranger. If you recall the previous chart, the Ranger was ahead of the others without using magic and without using Colossus Slayer. With both those added in, the Ranger has simply flown on ahead, simply adding magic damage on top of the weapons, and not entirely or solely relying on Hunter's Mark. Now, to be fair, we have completed only 7 levels out of 20, 35% of the possible levels of gameplay. At each level, except for the potentially aberrant level 3 for the Rogue, the Ranger has outperformed the others in total damage per level. Except for level 1, when the fighter gains their fighting style and the Ranger has not yet, the Ranger has consistently outperformed the fighter for average per hit, though not so much against the Rogue. Further, magic has not been shown, so far, to be necessary for the Ranger. Again, at least so far, in order to achieve this. I hope you're finding this analysis as interesting as I am, and that you will continue to explore the Ranger class with me, as well as joining Adrian, Thea, and Varen in the Land of the Hunter. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.